Today we're talking about two other types that I'm willing to compare, in this case INTJ and INTP. I see a lot of people discussing the differences between these two types and not being sure whether they are one, the other, or maybe something else. So I will go a little bit deeper and talk about the difference in cognitive functions, more specifically the difference between introverted intuition and extroverted intuition, as well as the difference between extroverted thinking and introverted thinking. On top of that, I would also like to discuss about how these two types have a pretty different interaction style as well as communication style. So all about that in the next few minutes. If you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Before I dive deeper into the video, I would like to remind you that I offer one-on-one coaching sessions via video call that are aimed at helping you develop yourself through a variety of methods. MBTI and Enneagram are some of the topics that I use and discuss to help you boost self-awareness and increase your well-being. But other than that, I also touch on other related, let's say, areas of expertise of mine, such as career development, improvement of communication, public speaking skills, conflict management skills, and so on. So feel free to check out the link in the description below. It will redirect you to my website, and there you'll find all the relevant information about how to book and so on and so forth. So, getting back to the topic of our video today, INTJ versus INTP. What are really the differences between these two types? What is really important to know? Well, first of all, we have two types that have completely opposite cognitive functions. Even though they share the first three letters, they are both introverts, they are both intuitive, they are both thinkers. They do have very, very different cognitive functions. Okay, so the INTJ has introverted intuition and introverted feeling, as well as extroverted thinking and extroverted sensing, whereas the INTP has introverted thinking and introverted sensing, as well as extroverted intuition and extroverted feeling. Now, if we look at the difference between introverted intuition, so INTJs, this is their dominant function, versus extroverted intuition for INTPs, which is their auxiliary or parent function, we see a pretty big difference here. Something that I've mentioned in a lot of my previous videos, for example, the one where I talked about INFJ versus INFP, or ENFJ versus ENFP, or simply NI versus NE, I mentioned the fact that introverted intuition and extroverted intuition have very different directions of, let's say, operating. On the one hand, we have introverted intuition, okay? This function kind of likes cleaning the world of ideas and concepts. On the other hand, we have extroverted intuition, a function that does quite the opposite. It likes spreading ideas and concepts into a lot of different directions and thrives in chaos when it comes to ideas and concepts. So an INTJ is more likely to say, okay, I see this idea and this idea and this idea, and this is an interesting perspective and this is another interesting perspective. But really, all of these things boil down to the same most important concept or idea. Okay, so introverted intuition narrows all of these things down into one single coherent idea, a generalized principle. Sometimes introverted intuitive types, in this case the INTJ, might be, let's say, attacked by other people and told that they are too generalistic in the way that they handle things. And well, this is kind of true. Neuroscience research carried out by Dario Nardi shows us that in the case of people who have introverted intuition as a very developed function, so INTJ is one of them, we notice a tendency to be generalists over specialists. So INTJs are much more likely to kind of take themselves somewhere up and look at the whole picture from a much more broader perspective, being willing to generalize all of these ideas and concepts to one that kind of encompasses different perspectives at the same time. It kind of asks the question, what is this really about? Okay, all these perspectives are cool, but what is this really about? On the other hand, extroverted intuition, which is the parent or secondary auxiliary function of the INTP, operates on a different principle. Again, if we look at neuroscience research, we see that the brain of extroverted intuitives, so all NP types, has a tendency to look like a Christmas tree. This is what Dario Nardi mentioned in his book, and I thought it was a brilliant analogy because it basically shows us the creativity, brainstorming approach that this function has. It basically says, well, we have this idea. Thank you, introverted intuitive, for giving me this idea, this concept, this generalization. But how about this? And how about that? And how about the other thing? Have you considered this other perspective? What if you also look at it from this angle? What if, what if, what if? Intuitives in general are more likely to ask what if, what if, what if. But this is even more prevalent for extroverted intuitive types like the INTP. So an INTP is less likely to settle at a generalized conclusion and is much more interested in exploring what that conclusion might also mean. How else could we look at that same conclusion? What else is there to consider about this idea? And so on and so forth. Okay, and I'm going to link the idea of communication styles to this NI versus NE perspective because there's a pretty visible difference between INTJs and INTPs when it comes to communication. INTJs are direct communicators, and I'm going to touch a little bit more on this at the end of the video. But for now, the important thing to know is that INTJs as direct communicators are much more likely to give you shorter, more concise answers to questions, are more likely to focus on the main red thread of the conversation and leave details out unless you specifically ask for them. Whereas INTPs are more likely to be informative communicators. This means that they have a tendency to give you more detailed answers. They are more likely to beat around the bush, not necessarily in a negative way, but simply giving you more context to make sure that you understood what they wanted to say, to make sure that you have all the relevant information. Now again, you don't have to look at this in a very extremist way and say that in all situations this happens, because all people can be both direct and informative in their communication. We all have moments when we are direct and we all have moments when we are informative. However, if you look at a pattern, so at what is the communication style that repeats itself over time, you'll notice that INTJs are much more likely to be direct, whereas INTPs are much more likely to be informative. Okay, now if we look at the difference in thinking functions, we have extroverted thinking, which is the secondary or parent function of the INTJ, and we have introverted thinking, which is the dominant or hero function of the INTP. Again, I made another video discussing these two functions into more depth, so feel free to check it out. It's called extroverted thinking versus introverted thinking, or the other way around. But here I would like to summarize those points again. Basically, extroverted thinking, so the function that INTJs prioritize, is more likely to look for data that they consider to be reliable. This is why a lot of TE types say, well, I want to find an expert. I want to find someone that I can trust with respect to this topic. And I'm going to take the information that they're giving me, integrate it quickly, and move forward. Take this information and act on it, do something about it, move forward, execute a plan, create a strategy. On the other hand, INTPs with their introverted thinking are much more likely to need more time to process, analyze, and check whether the information that they have received from the outside fits their internal logical framework. INTPs are much more likely to say, well, okay, thank you for, telling me this particular fact or giving me this piece of information or sharing this theory or idea with me. But now I don't care so much if you're an expert or not. What I care about is trying to understand how this piece of information fits into my internal logical puzzle, okay? So they will go through this process and they might take longer because accuracy matters so much to TI types. Whereas in the case of TE types, extroverted thinking types, efficiency and speed matters more. Now again, I'm not saying this happens 100% of the time because INTJs still have TI even as a critic function in their shadow. So sometimes they will spend more time checking the information. And yes, sometimes INTPs will also, want to move forward and trust what the expert told them. But again, we are looking at patterns, at a thing that repeats more and more. And this is definitely something that we notice with these two different functions. Now, something else that I would just shortly mention here. I said at the beginning that INTJs have introverted feeling, whereas INTPs have extroverted feeling. And I'm not going to go into depth here discussing these two functions. Again, I've done it before. You can check out my video where I compare FE and FI. But what I'd like to say here is a personal observation of mine. If you look at how introverted feeling types versus extroverted feeling types express emotion, you'll see that the extroverted feeling type, so in this case INTP, tend to be much more colorful with their expression of emotion. They tend to be more, let's say, all-encompassing with their portrayal of emotion. Their face might show you more than the introverted feeling types, who tend to have a more maybe poker face. They tend to be less expressive in general and more likely to show a certain emotion when they actually feel it. If they really, really, really like something, they will show it more emotionally, whereas the FE types might just let themselves get carried away by the emotions that other people feel. If they're in a group, for example, they might absorb the energy of the group and show more because of this. The INTP has FE as their inferior function, so this will not be as obvious as, for example, with an ENFJ or an ESFJ, but it will still be there. So maybe something to look out for if you're not sure about someone else's type. This can be a little bit of a clue. Okay, and the last thing that I would like to talk about here is interaction style. If we're looking at Linda Burns's theory, we see that different types have different ways of interacting with the world. INTJs are finishers or chart the course types, whereas INTPs are behind the scenes types. And in this way they differ quite a lot. First of all, in their communication style, something I mentioned earlier, INTJs being direct communicators and INTPs being informative communicators. But on top of that, INTJs are much more likely to say, okay, this is my goal, this is my long-term future plan, this is what I want to accomplish, and they will mobilize their energy and resources to finish that thing, to check things off a list. On the other hand, INTPs, being behind the scenes types, are much more likely to believe in the idea that, well, if I plant seeds, things will bloom eventually. They are much less goal-focused and more so process-focused. Okay? They spend much more time investing in creating a well-rounded understanding of things and believing that, the more seeds they plant, the more likely it is that they will achieve a good result or have a good understanding, and so on and so forth. So again, this is quite a notable difference in the way this type approach work-related things especially, but you can see it in their personal lives as well. Okay, so we looked at differences between NI and NE, TI and TE, a little bit about FI and FE, and we also looked at interaction styles and communication styles. Now, if you have any other insights, any other particular differences that you notice between these two types, feel free to share them with me in the comment section below. And again, thanks a lot for being with me. Thanks a lot for watching this video. See you next time with another video on typology.